Hey, good afternoon, everyone. In history of the United States Constitution, I wanted to put up a video lecture covering this early material that really predates um, the first Constitution we had, called the Articles of Confederation, and our own U.S. Constitution, which came into play in 1789, but it was 1787 that it was formed and written and drafted. But we have to talk. It's a history class. We have to talk about its roots. In this book, which I think is fantastic, just reading it. My office is a mess, as you can tell the way I'm reaching around looking for different books. Um, but it's really going into the nuts and bolts of everything from the preamble on. And how did I lose it in a moment's time? I was just reading it and looking through it. Oh, it's right here. I've got different levels of my desk. But it is, again, The Words We Live by, Linda R. Monk. And she starts right off with, hey, here's the preamble. She talks a little bit about the Articles of Confederation. But what she doesn't talk about is basically the nation's birth, its early inception. We were, at one time, in different sections of North America, influenced by the Spanish, the French, the English, the Dutch, even the Swedes. There were many different countries colonizing North and South America. And eventually, though, after 1763, we know the British really become the dominant. The 13 colonies are really dominated by English philosophical views of governance and culture. Not that the Dutch, the French, and the Spanish didn't have, and others, have a huge influence on those communities, but politically, eventually it evolved into the British dominating the colonies. And we know this is the result of what we call the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War. The Great Britain wins with the help of the colonists. The colonists saw themselves as English, and they fought against the French and their Indian allies. The British also had Indian allies, and they break away. Prior to that, though, the American colonies identified as being British. They very much did. They celebrated, the king, and they celebrated the recognition of being part of the British Empire. But the British Empire wasn't expecting a lot from them directly. It was indirectly through a system called mercantilism or mercantilism. This concept of basically a favorable balance of trade. We'll benefit from the colonies through trade, but not really through taxation. And there was actually a system of what they called salutary neglect. They let the colonies fairly much run themselves. We were a bit autonomous within the British Empire in terms of governance, and we liked it. And after 1763, that changes dramatically. I know there was other laws in effect, but they were seldom enforced, like the Navigation Act. Other principles like that were loosely enforced up until that time. Well, what happens after 1763? Great Britain and us, the colonies, we win the 7 Years' War at great financial costs. The British treasury is drained. They are in financial woes. And they finally have to say, the other parts of the British Empire are paying taxes. They're paying their fair share. They're contributing to the health and the wealth of the British Empire. It's time for the colonies to do the same. And the reaction was, rather stunning. I would argue that it was shocking how initially the Sugar Act, and then the Stamp Act, and then the Townsend Acts, all these series of acts that were designed to raise money and start to control the colonies under more British authoritarian guidance, caused the revolution. I mean, there are multiple causes, but that was a big part of it, this concept of taxation. And the colonists were upset. They see themselves as British citizens, saying, how can you tax us when we're not even represented over in Parliament? And we saw ourselves as uniquely British in part of the empire, but we didn't think we were getting a fair deal under the Constitution because we didn't have representation. And the old slogan, like every other slogan, is more complicated than it actually sounds. But taxation without representation was part of it. The British leadership over in Great Britain said, but you have virtual representation. The members of Parliament over here in England represent you too. They represent the whole Commonwealth. They have a fiduciary obligation to represent the whole realm. We didn't buy it. We had a philosophical belief in the colonies that representation has to come from the locality. I can't have somebody representing me from Massachusetts who lives in Texas. I can have somebody from my local community representing me. And we came to a philosophical difference over that question, and ultimately the Revolutionary Wars fought. After it ends, our first form of government we call Articles of Confederation. We're actually 13 independent countries really agreeing to be a confederacy. And a confederacy is just that. It's a sort of a league of nations. We're going to get along and we're going to try to do some things together, but it's all based upon consent. We're, literally, if you read the Articles of Confederation, I think I put it up there, I should, but when you read the Articles of Confederation, it's a league of friendship. And there's no real enforcement provision for anything about currency, taxation, raising a national militia. It really creates a very anemic federal government. The federal government's pretty much, paper tiger is really what it is. And the states have all the control. The problem with that is when problems start to develop in different states, including Massachusetts with Shays' Rebellion, local farmers are all going bankrupt. They want some debt relief from the State House in Boston. They're not getting it. So they revolt out in Western Mass, and they actually try to take over the Springfield Armory, located at Springfield Technical Community College as part of the same campus. And the federal government can't do anything about it. And George Washington's appalled, and all the other great revolutionary leaders that we had were so shocked that we could do nothing about it because we didn't really have a federal government. And they recognized they needed to do something. Initially, they met in Annapolis, not Indianapolis, Annapolis in Maryland. Only, I think, 3 or 4 of the colonies showed up, but Hamilton was there. I think Madison was there. And they said, we're going to have another meeting next year. They invited all 13 colonies. Everyone except good old Rhode Island showed up. And they weren't there to overthrow the Articles of Confederation, but there was a recognition that it didn't work. What were their influences? What were their philosophies? Really, they were pretty much consistent with those that the British Empire held. Things like the Magna Carta of 1215, where the rights of man were contained in there, limitations on government authority, that the government was limited in its power and there was representation with it. We like that. So it was actually a fairly conservative revolution. The revolution wasn't necessarily to break away with the ideology. It was to break away and create self-rule. And the other thing we didn't like about the British Constitution was it wasn't entirely in writing. It's made up of several different writings, several historical rulings and precepts and historical declarations over centuries, giving it a nebulous understanding by some. And what the framers of our Constitution wanted was the recognition of the rule of law being paramount. That's what the Magna Carta held. That's what the British law held. That's what we wanted to basically steal and adopt and keep for our own. But we wanted the rest of the ramifications of how government would be structured in written form. And that's why we have the oldest, not constitution in the world. That would actually, I think it might be even Great Britain, but we have the oldest written constitution in the world. Because Great Britain's constitution is entirely in writing. Parts of it are basically on historical rulings and precepts and events. Very difficult to interpret. You have to be a bit of a soothsayer to know what it means. There's also the philosophical underpinnings of British philosophers like Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. John Locke, actually, his mantra was the pursuit of life, liberty, and not the pursuit of happiness, life, liberty, and the protection of personal property. It was Thomas Jefferson that changed that philosophical language to put in the pursuit of happiness to make it sound like a more glorified document in the Declaration of Independence. So we have these British philosophers where they said that government should almost be a social contract with the people, and the people need to be approving of their government in order for government to work in a real democracy. And we bought into that big time. Of course, we have Thomas Paine, who writes Common Sense, which reiterates these conceptions that people are given certain inalienable rights, and one of them is self-rule. We should be able to determine what a rule is. How sovereignty doesn't come from the top down, from like a king or from like a ruling class. It comes from the bottom up, from the people. We decide how we're going to be ruled. If we don't like it, we should be free to overthrow it. And these are the philosophical foundations of our political beliefs that are going to go into our Constitution. Problem is we have the Articles of Confederation. It's not working. It's not a total waste. I put that up, I think, in a discussion board question. I'm kind of giving it away. Hey, we managed to come to peace with Great Britain. We managed to get some loans from France and other foreign countries in order to support our burgeoning nation as a result and be recognized as a nation under the Articles of Confederation. And it caused us to become a nation. The problem is the nation was quickly falling apart under it. And they met down in Philadelphia in 1787. They said several months down there in the really hot summer, and all the representatives of the different states, each state had just a vote, but each state could send multiple representatives, but each state would basically vote to make amendments to the Articles of Confederation, but they realized very early on that they really had to change the whole document. And it was a revolution within a revolution. That's why one of my favorite books, and I wish I could remember the author's name, I'm terrible at that. One of the best books I've ever read about the American Revolution is called American Revolutions, because it's not just the initial revolution, but it's also the changing of the Articles of Confederation to the new United States Constitution that we ultimately adopted in 1787. It's the second revolution, but it's without arms, it's without force, it's without violence. It's basically community leaders, men that go down, that were leaders of the revolution in the first place, go down recognizing we have to have a stronger central government. And what are the two philosophical underpinnings that come out of Great Britain's Constitution? One is the rule of law. We wanted a nation that recognized the rule of law, not the rule of individuals or powerful groups, but the rule of law must be the final benchmark upon how which the nation shall be ruled. And we also wanted a government of representation. We wanted a republic. We didn't want basically the government being an arbitrary, capricious group of individuals or one individual having all the power, no matter how benevolent. We wanted it to be representative in nature, and that's what we call a republic. Related to that also is the concept that government should be limited. Government shouldn't be immersed into every aspect of the lives of our country. It should be limited to have a sovereign power only in certain realms. So we're going to enumerate the powers that the government is going to ultimately have. Now, I put up some excellent articles describing these philosophical underpinnings that came over from Great Britain and from the philosophical viewpoints of people like John Locke and Thomas Hobbes, and of course Thomas Paine, our own Thomas Paine, who wrote Common Sense here in the United States that helped spur us on to revolution against Great Britain. But that was sort of the foundation, is we have to talk about the history. We just didn't create it. But the other thing we did is right after the early inception of the revolution at the Continental Congress, we sent back representatives to all the states and say, you guys got a state in your home state. You have to create your own state constitutions, because we weren't sure we were going to create a strong central government. We thought we might have 13 independent governments working kind of cohesively together as a confederacy. So we had a good 10 years, or almost 10 years, yeah, maybe even 11 years, for states to experiment, for lack of a better way of saying it, on forming constitutions. And so sometimes when people think, well, we went down to Philadelphia in 1787, not really having any conception of what our governmental form should be, that's nonsense. Much of it's based upon the Magna Carta and the other principles in the British Constitution, but it's also based upon the learnings from the state constitutional development that occurred. And I always urge students, and I should probably put it up on Blackboard, the Massachusetts Constitution, and you compare it to the federal constitution that was drafted in 1887 and ultimately adopted throughout the country in 1789. What's fascinating about it is it looks so much like the Massachusetts Constitution. So they say they had nothing to work off of. It was all original. There was all these brilliant men going down to Philadelphia, coming up with a new idea in the flesh, in the moment. It's nonsense. They were working off these examples that were working in the different states, and I would argue substantially from Massachusetts. 3 branches of government, checks and balances, and inherently the rights of man. The rights of man were incorporated in the British Constitution, and they were certainly going to be something we were going to adopt in our own Constitution, although not initially. That's kind of shocking that when we left in 1787 to have the Constitution endorsed or approved by the states, by the people, not by the state legislatures, by the people of the states, would have special constitutional conventions just to vote on it. It's pretty remarkable. And when they did, one of the big objections were, we don't have a list of here about the inalienable rights that we want protected from government interference, those civil liberties and civil rights. And there was promises made that it would, at the first Congress, that we would actually adopt a Bill of Rights. And ultimately there were 10 proposed, and that's what we call the Bill of Rights. The first 10 amendments were ultimately proposed as a compromise to get the states to ultimately approve the adoption of our new United States Constitution. So this is constitutional history, and part of constitutional history is, what the heck does a document mean? Document's pretty short. I'm going to post that too. I urge you to read it. I've taken many constitutional law classes, many constitutional history classes, maybe even just parts of the Constitution. Guess what we never seem to do in these classes, which I don't get? We don't read the freaking Constitution. We read interpretations of the Constitution. I think you have to read the Constitution to be at least legitimate. It's kind of like saying, I know this great book and it's a wonderful book and everyone should read it, but I've never read it. I've read what other people have told me about it. It's a scary phenomenon, but I think we all kind of do that sometimes. We should all read the Constitution. And that's one of the things I do like about our author, Linda Monk. She does a great job going from literally from the beginning to the end. We're going to start with we the people. It's the first clause, the opening clause, or the preamble, because although in and of itself there are no rights and duties or obligations of government within it, it still shows the intent of what the document is framed for. And you can argue that in court or before the Supreme Court or just in political debate. If we're trying to determine what the document should mean in a certain context, we have to start with the preamble. But even before that, we have to start with the history. Why did we adopt the damn thing? Why did we also share power between the federal central government and the state government? The states retained a lot of power, and the power is always rooted where? In the people. That's cornball stuff, but it's actually true. We have the power to alter that Constitution. We have the power to alter the power vis-a-vis the federal government and the state governments. And we know they shifted dramatically after the Civil War. Some people could argue, although it's definitely over slavery and as a significant vehicle for why the Civil War occurred, but it's also over states' rights versus federal authority. Anyways, I'm getting way off track. I'm getting really fired up over it because I do love the history of the Constitution. But it's a document that isn't very long. It's a document that has wordsmithing in it. When you read it, you may say, oh, I get what this means. But then a contextual question will come up and say, does the president have the power to do that? Does the Congress have the power to do it? Does the House of Representatives have a role? Is the Senate the role? Can the court do something on that? Can one state do something vis-a-vis another or vis-a-vis the federal government? And then we read the Constitution, and sometimes guess what we get? Not really sure. So that's why it's very important we study case law, because it's the courts that will ultimately determine what the Constitution means, unless we file an amendment to the United States Constitution if we're upset about what the court has ruled, or if we get the court to overrule itself, which is very rare. But this is just a quick way of introduction. I hate to jump right into this book because it starts right with the preamble, gives you a little bit of history about the Articles of Confederation, but you need to start a little bit about the Revolutionary War and why we broke away from Great Britain and kind of the philosophical underpinnings of what we put in that Constitution and for what reasons, because we were dissatisfied with the certain things in which way Mother England was treating us during that time, and we didn't want to have to repeat that under our own sovereignty coming from the people. We wanted a better form of government that the people were satisfied with, and they created their own. We're self-governing. Hopefully that's not too scattered for your understanding, but that's kind of what I want to get out of this sort of pre-material, that before you really jump in the book as soon as you can. It's very inexpensive. It's excellent. But prior to that, you should look at those links and those readings that I put up in those videos. I put up some really good videos to get a sense of what were we really bitching about in the Revolutionary War, what were we upset about, and what were we trying to adopt when we created not only the Articles of Confederation, but more importantly, our United States Constitution, the oldest living written constitution in the world. Other than that, please reach out with questions, concerns, anything at all. I think my tests are very straightforward. My paper is very straightforward. I just want to something in the Constitution I'm really interested in, especially when we get to the Bill of Rights and civil liberties and civil rights. Students really want to jump on something and talk about some of your, I was going to say cop majors. I guess it's called criminal justice majors. I'm a criminal defense attorney, so you want to talk about the Fourth Amendment. You want to talk about the right of counsel or trial process, being able to confront the witnesses. Whatever it is you're interested in, you get to write a paper on it and do some research. And some people say, well, the library is not open as COVID. You can do all the research online. You don't have to read multiple volumes of books. You can find some scholarly articles, and I'll help you do it. You should have fun in the course. It's a very important course, not because I think it is. It's a very important course because you're in the United States, and this is our governing contract with our government, the authority that may make us do something or prevent something that we might want to do, and we want to understand that basic civic rule of law that emanates from the Constitution and flows down that the people have created. Anyways, have a good weekend, nowhere near it, but have a good day, and hopefully some of this stuff makes sense. And obviously, when we get into the actual body of the Constitution and study cases related to it, these little mini, I don't know if you want to call them lectures or discussions, will be more concrete and more tangible, I hope.